Lovely. Okay, so one of the things that would be good to talk about is how to kind of measure people's perception, and kind of maybe some demographics using the area. Now, the really kind of common thing to go through with this is questionnaires. It's a really good way of getting kind of people's views who are invested in the area, who are using the area. So questionnaires absolutely is a good technique. With questionnaires, something to consider is how to construct a useful questionnaire, and there are lots of examples online. But you'll hear a lot about kind of closed questions, open questions, so you'll need to consider getting a mix of those kind of things to get the data that you want. But it's not just questionnaires that you can use to kind of think about the people using an area. So what I want to do in this video is just talk about kind of other ways in which you can look at who is using this area. One thing to think about is possible kind of the idea of stakeholders. So with questionnaires, you are approaching people, potentially thinking about kind of the idea of kind of taking the opportunity, almost kind of edging towards opportunistic sampling, of say, I'm just going to ask the people who are there, who are approachable, who will answer my questionnaire. Stakeholders is moving towards the kind of more stratified sampling, actually selecting people who are invested or have an interest in the area, potentially business owners or local residents, and conducting potentially more long-form interviews as well, actually spending a little bit more time with those stakeholders to kind of gather their views. So that's another kind of thing to think about people. And remember, those interviews don't have to be face-to-face interviews. There are other ways you can collect stakeholder views, or in fact questionnaires. You know, there are things like email or Zoom calls and that kind of thing. So
Facebook groups are often a really good way of going with stratified sampling. If you know you're looking for the opinions of mothers in the area, going to find a Facebook group that's for that local area, that is for mums, is one way of doing that. Similarly, if you're looking for students, then that demographic is going to have different sort of community groups, whether that's based on the hall, so the hall's residents having a Facebook group or something like that, where you could share your questionnaire. Equally, if you get in touch with somebody via email that you think might be an expert in the topic that you're investigating, if you email a set of questions and get a set of responses back, that's effectively like a written interview, isn't it? It's like a transcript of that. So if you are unable to create, say for instance, a Zoom call with somebody, actually having a transcript of what people have given you as their opinion, professional or as a local resident, is totally valid.
Absolutely. And then those are good ways of kind of physically getting people's perceptions, actually asking their opinion, but there are other data collection techniques that involve people. So to stick with the idea of perception for the moment, one of the things you could do is kind of expand that idea of people's perception and actually think about, well, if people perceive an area in a certain way, it's going to impact upon that area. So potentially if it was perceived in a negative way, then actually maybe there would be economic decline in that area, people wouldn't want to be going there, there might be a decline in the environmental quality because people are not willing to look after it because they're not as invested in that area. So there are kind of other ways in which you can look at how people interact with that area that will tell you about their perception of it. The other thing to think about is kind of who's using an area and maybe where and how they're using it. So one method that doesn't involve kind of talking to people is thinking about pedestrian counts. Now, pedestrian counts, initially when you say it sound very, very simplistic, but a way to think about it is pedestrian flows and actually where people are moving in areas. So this is where your sampling strategy comes in. So if you want to do a pedestrian count, what you're not going to do is just plonk yourself somewhere because there's a bench and do your survey there. What you're actually going to do is you're going to think about, well, hang on a minute, what am I trying to show? Where should I be collecting that data? And you might find that actually you're looking at flows in and out of an area, or therefore it makes sense to collect pedestrian counts at the entrances and exits to an area. And that would be an example of stratified sampling. Or it might be that you want to look at how busy an area is, so you choose to do a transect through that area, a line, and you do pedestrian counts along that transect, and then you can work out where is the busiest in that area. So there are just a couple of examples. You could, if you had an area, you could do random sampling, where you randomly pick areas and then do pedestrian counts. However, you have to be quite careful with random sampling in that respect, because if you are looking at a specific thing like people and you do random sampling, all of your random points end up where people can't access, roads or car parks or whatever, then it might not be the best sampling strategy. So you need to pick an appropriate sampling strategy for what you're trying to do. But we're talking more detailed than just counting the number of people, thinking about where they're going, how many are going in that direction. You can start to build up flow maps or isoline graphs of where people are.
Equally, you could probably categorize the types of people that you see in an area. So for instance, today, as we've been wandering around, something that has struck me and surprised me is the number of mums out with buggies, young children, and some of that is an indication of perhaps the time of day that we're in, that, you know, the types of people that are off work on that. But it also says something about the space, that there's quite a lot of open space, it's very safe, it's car free. These are the kinds of areas where people might use the space in a particular way, and as we observe how the space is being used by these people, it tells us something about how they perceive that place. They perceive it to be safe, it's quite open, it might be quite friendly, it might have, say, activities. For example, there are fountains in the area and it's quite a warm day, so the kids are playing in the fountains. So there's a lot of food around, there's a lot of sort of perhaps shops that fit the right price point for those mothers.
Yeah, so something that would link into that is something called non-participant observation. And the idea of non-participant observation is you are making some observations around how people are using the space and who is using the space. Now, there are lots of considerations with non-participant observations, but it's a really good opportunity to bring in the idea of kind of ethics into what we're doing. So when we talk about permission with kind of people and collecting fieldwork, if you're doing questionnaires, permission is almost explicit. You're saying, can I ask you some questions? And they either say yes or no. And that is the permission right there. If you're doing participant observations, that's a little bit less clear cut. Now, what you could do is you could say, right, I'm going to do participant observations in a certain area, and I'm going to set somebody up at one end, somebody up at the other, and everybody who goes past, excuse me, don't mind that person over there with a clipboard, they're just observing everything you do. And the problem there is they're probably then not going to interact with that space in the same way. Now, if you're in a public area, then actually there's no need to gain that permission because they are in that public area. However, you have to be very careful about the information you are collecting. Because if they are non-participant observations, this goes the same with questionnaires and pedestrian counts as well, but particularly with non-participant observations, you don't want to collect any kind of identifying personal information about somebody. You also want to be really, really careful not to make assumptions based on prejudices or just kind of assumptions that you don't have the full information on. So things like gender, for example, things like ethnic background are very difficult to do without actually asking somebody, and even then there are ethical considerations around that. So I would be looking a lot more about kind of thinking about maybe how people are dressed. Do they look like they come from the office? Do they look like they're out for a day out? Families, as Miss suggested. What are people doing? Are they playing in the fountains? Are they eating? Those kind of things which aren't divulging personal information, aren't making judgments, but are observing how people are using the space. One example would be we just stopped for lunch down by the canal, and we were surrounded by office workers who had escaped from the office. They were all talking about property and buying property and house prices, and they were talking about the fact that they were out for lunch and they were soon going to have to go back into the office, and that's how they were using that space. So that just gives you a bit of an example about those kind of non-participant observations and how they can be used.
Any more people-based investigative sort of techniques, methods that we can think about?
Yeah, so how obviously people is a social thing, and in terms of kind of training towards secondary data, there's stuff like social media, which is a really, really good way of looking at how people interact with a place. So you have things, we've already mentioned about kind of Facebook groups for talking to people, but actually things like Twitter, where people are tweeting about their experiences of a place. Twitter's really useful because you've got hashtags, as you have with Instagram, so you can look at how people are kind of tagging themselves in a particular location, and you can even code those tweets and those Instagrams. So I talked about coding earlier, but the idea is you could search by location where people are tagged themselves. Are they a positive tweet? Is it a negative tweet? Are things being mentioned? Can you pick out keywords and present in a word cloud? Those kind of things. Instagram, for example, Snapchat, for example, you have filters, but actually what you can do is you can have geo-fenced filters in Snapchat. So companies can pay to have filters that appear only in certain locations. So if, for example, to use King's Cross example, they wanted to promote King's Cross, they might pay for a geo-fenced filter on Snapchat that's like, we love King's Cross, for example. So when you do that, you could take that photo and put it on social media. So you can look at how people are trying to promote an area on social media, but also how people are kind of interacting with an area and what they have to say about it.
Yeah, absolutely. That idea about hashtags and particularly looking for tweets or posts in particular locations to garner people's perceptions of that place or how they choose to present that place is a really, really interesting idea in terms of interpreting perception. So really lovely ideas. Thank you so much.
Sorry.